other day, more or less in this part here. We were talking about the factors that affect the heart rate, the conductivity of the heart, sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous systems. And so this is something that is not difficult to understand after you study the actions of the autonomic nervous system and you put it together with the pacemaker potentials that you see there. Okay, if you have a sympathetic stimulation, okay, we are going to increase the conduction velocity. In the AV node, we are going to increase the rate of depolarization of the cells of the heart, of these pacemaker cells, leading to a faster depolarization. So we are going to reach the threshold more frequently, and we are going to have the spread of this electricity to the contractile cells of the heart. So that way we are going to increase the heart rate. We are going to increase at the same time the force of contraction, the contractility. Okay, and if you have instead of having a sympathetic stimulation, we have a parasympathetic stimulation, we're going to have the contrary. Okay, we're going to have a slower conduction, slower depolarizations, leading to a more slower heart rate. Okay, simply it's the same thing. Okay, comparing the sympathetic and the parasympathetic stimulation. There you have some examples of factors that increase the sympathetic stimulation, maybe stress or maybe medications, adrenergic drugs. Or we can also have a decrease vagal parasympathetic stimulation. Okay, hypoxia or cholinergic drugs may decrease the heart rate or the conduction velocity in this case. That will lead to a decrease in the heart rate. Now, the second section, okay, I made some changes there. Removed some stuff. The new PowerPoint is in both in the drive and also in Canvas. I put some things in another place. I added some slides, removed some slides. We're trying to find a more logical flow to the information. This part contains many concepts that have to be mastered properly. Okay, some of them look very similar. Some of them sometimes are used like synonyms, like if they are the same. They have tiny differences in their concepts. It's important to know how to apply them. Okay, we are going to be studying circulation. Okay, how the blood circulates. We were talking about this the other day. I made the question. Okay, why or what makes the blood circulate? How the blood gets to circulate? Okay, because there is a difference in pressure. Okay, between different points in the circulatory system. The left ventricle generates a pressure, okay, that during systole is 120, 130 millimeters of mercury. That sends the blood throughout the circulatory system, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and that returns to the right side of the heart. Okay, in the venous circulation, we don't have any pump, actual muscular pump, but we have the action of for example, the respiratory pump, where we inhale, the actions of the muscles in the legs that are helping the blood circulate in the venous part of the circulation. And that is very important because when we are at rest, 70% of our blood is located in the veins. Okay, so we have 30% of the blood, okay, distributed in the arterial part of the circulation and the capillaries, and 70%, most of it is in the veins. So we need to put that blood in motion. So it's not only the heart doing diastole, okay, and trying to create a vacuum, a negative pressure to get that blood has to be helped by the respiratory system, the lungs, and also the muscular pump. And here we have the basics of that, of those principles. Okay, the blood moves from one point to another because of the difference in pressure. Okay, we are going to be talking about some variables, about some concepts. Okay, and the most important is the blood flow that we normally represent as Q. Okay, that is determined by the difference in pressure gradient between different points, in this case A and B, and it's going to be inversely proportional to the resistance, okay, that generally speaking, the resistance in our body is given by the degree of constriction or dilation of the arterioles. Okay, that is the most important factor determining the resistance to the circulation. Okay, anytime you study fluids, how fluids move in arteries, veins, in a pipe, in a tube, you're going to study certain factors that favor or oppose the movement of the fluid. Okay, we were studying something for the industry. We were talking about the friction of the materials, or the pipe, for example. But in our blood circulation, it's not only the friction of the blood against the walls of the blood vessels, also the diameter that changes. Okay, increases, decreases because of the action of the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. We are studying the plumbing system at home. Okay, the pipes that don't dilate or constrict. Okay, we simply use valves to move the water from one place to another, open, close, etc. Now, the pressure gradient, the difference in pressure in our blood circulation is given by the difference in pressure between the arterial and the venous side of the circulation. Okay, so we typically calculate the gradient, by simply determining the difference between the mean arterial pressure, that is normally around 90, 92, and the mean venous pressure that typically is around 0. Okay, so we actually don't, in physiological conditions, don't even have in mind the venous circulation or the venous pressure because it's typically around 0. Let me show you this thing that I was doing before, and I didn't want to include that in the PowerPoint so nobody tries to memorize those numbers. And this is representing the pressures that we normally develop in the different parts of the circulation, mostly in the different chambers of the heart. Okay, and we start on the left with the right atrium. If you measure the pressure in the right atrium, it's going to have exactly the same pressure that we have in the superior inferior vena cava, that is typically below 5. Can go from 0 to 5. So during the diastole of the atria, the pressure is going to be 0, and during the systole, it's going to go to around 5. Then the blood is going to move to the right ventricle. Notice that in diastole, the right ventricle will have a pressure of 5, is the pressure that developed the atria during contraction. And during systole, the right ventricle is going to generate the pressure of 25, pushing that blood towards the pulmonary artery. Okay, that is going to develop pressure that is going to be between 25 and 10. Then the blood is going to move into the lung capillaries. Okay, it's receiving the blood from the ventricle, the right ventricle, 25, and then the blood spreads, the pressure decreases in the pulmonary circulation to around 10. Then we have a pressure in the pulmonary vein going towards the heart that should be always below 12. Okay, it's going to be normally around 10. But why I tell you always below 12? Because this is one very important pressure that you need to memorize. Because this is one of the pressures that we measure when we do catheterizations to patients. Okay, this is a pressure that we call pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Let me write it here. Okay, it's called pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Wedge. Okay, that is a measure that we use to indirectly estimate the pressure in the right atrium. Okay, you simply put a catheter, in the pulmonary artery, the main pulmonary artery, then move it towards the left side. When you have the catheter in the left part, you open a balloon, blocking the circulation in the pulmonary artery. Now you are indirectly measuring the pressure in the left atrium. Okay, something that we are going to use to determine if the patient has heart failure, volume overload, together with other clinical findings. Notice that when we look at the pressure in the pulmonary vein, well, we're actually looking at the pressure in the left atrium. In the left atrium, we develop a pressure always below 12 in normal conditions. Okay, and then the left ventricle during diastole is going to have that pressure that because of the blood that it receives from the atrium. Okay, remember I told you there should be a 10, but I put the 12 because it's the maximum that we accept as normal. And then the left ventricle develops a pressure during systole of 120. So the pressure in the left ventricle is systolic 120, diastolic 10. And that 120 is going to be transmitted to the aorta. So the aorta during systole is going to have a pressure that we measure around 120, 130. And during diastole, when the aortic valve closes, the pressure inside the aorta is going to be 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and then that blood is going to circulate, okay, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, and it's going to return, okay, to the right side of the heart. And that's what keeps the blood in motion, okay, that difference in pressure that is, or those different pressures that is developed by the different chambers of the heart. And this is the organization of the cardiovascular system as we know it. Okay, nothing new here. Notice that the cardiovascular system can be studied as two separate hearts, okay, that deal with a different type of blood. Okay, the left side of the heart is the one that pumps the blood to the systemic circulation. Okay, after it receives the blood oxygenated from the lungs, that blood circulates through the systemic arteries, okay, towards different organs. There, the oxygen is going to be delivered to the tissues. That blood is going to pick up CO2 and wastes, and that deoxygenated blood is going to be taken, okay, to the, following the systemic veins towards the right side of the heart. That is going to send the blood towards the lungs, okay, to eliminate the CO2 and get oxygen from there. Notice that this diagram is representing the two circulations, the systemic and the pulmonary circulation. And notice how all this circulation is like organized in series. Okay, so one of these cavities, one of these structures after the other. And if you continue studying the circulation and you start studying the branches, for example, of the aorta, okay, that goes to different organs, that circulation is organized in parallel. For example, there are arteries that will go to the heart, arteries that will go to the arms, muscles, arteries that will go to the lungs, lung tissue itself, to the liver, to the stomach. Okay, so these arteries are organized in parallel, not in series. Because imagine that we had the organs one after the other. Let's say we have the heart, then the stomach, then the small intestine, then the large intestine. That would mean that the blood that the stomach was going to receive is the one that comes from the heart. So it's a blood that almost has no oxygen there. And then the blood that the stomach decides to release is the one that the small intestine is going to receive. And then after that blood is with no oxygen at all, maybe the colon, maybe the liver. Okay, so we organize the different organs in parallel, so all the organs receive more or less the same amount of oxygen. The only exception to that is when women are pregnant. Okay, the fetus receives blood that is practically deoxygenated. Okay, it's the venous blood from the mother. Okay, imagine all the blood, or the venous blood from the mother, after it has moved throughout different organs, has very low oxygen, then enters the placenta, and from the placenta there is a diffusion of oxygen from the venous blood of the mother to the blood of the fetus. And you may say, oh my goodness, honey, is that a good idea to have a baby, a fetus receiving 9 months deoxygenated blood? Well, it's a great idea, because when you have a blood that is very high in oxygen, that will lead to vasoconstriction of the blood vessels that go to the brain. And we don't need that for a fetal development of the nervous system. So it's better to have a blood that is low in oxygen, so there is vasodilation to the blood vessels that go to the brain, and the brain is the one that receives most of the blood. Besides, we are going to study the differences in the hemoglobin, fetal and adult hemoglobin. Okay, the fetal hemoglobin has such a great affinity for oxygen that you can provide it with a blood that has maybe 30% oxygen, and it's going to get all the oxygen that is available because of the high affinity of the fetal blood for hemoglobin. So this is more or less the organization of the cardiovascular system. And now we are going to be starting with some of the concepts. Remember, I told you one of the most important concepts we are going to be talking about today is blood flow. Okay, and as the name says, is simply the flow, the movement of the blood throughout the circulation, something that we've been advancing since the last lecture. Okay, the blood flow is it's a measure, okay, that is, it's a variable that we measure in milliliters per minute, or we can measure in liters per minute. When we say, for example, that the cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, we are telling the blood flow throughout the heart, or from the heart, okay, is 5 liters per minute. Okay, typically the blood moves from high pressure to low pressure. And of course, this blood flow during exercise is going to be a lot higher. Okay, in exercise, the cardiac output can go up to 10 liters per minute, 15, 20 liters per minute, depending on the exercise that we are saying, we are doing. Okay, and the direction is going to be typically from the arteries, okay, to arterioles, to capillaries, and then to veins, and then, okay, complete the circulation. Could it go backwards? Of course it can go backwards. If for any reason we have an increase in the pressure in the venous part of the circulation, or we have a heart that is unable to generate pressure, is unable to contract properly, the blood is going to accumulate, okay, and it's going to move backwards. It's going to increase the pressures inside the lungs, okay, and it's going to produce something that we call pulmonary edema. Okay, we're going to be studying how the circulation can go backwards, but that's going to be in pathophysiology. Now, we have another concept here that is the one that is sometimes confused with blood flow, but it's simply blood flow velocity. Okay, or if you don't want to mess up your mind, you say blood velocity. Okay, blood velocity or blood flow velocity. Sometimes you see this as blood flow rate, but it's exactly the same. Notice that this is measured in centimeters per second. It's like the speed of the car. How many miles per hour? How many, okay, feet per minute? How many centimeters per second, okay, the blood moves? Okay, it's the speed of the blood. Notice that this is a concept that is sometimes difficult to understand. Okay, I put some diagrams there trying to make it, okay, easier to understand. When you see all these concepts in a diagram, it's better than just reading. Okay, and this measures the blood flow. Okay, so the previous measure over the cross-sectional area of the arteries, arterioles, veins in the body. Okay, something that we are going to see better, as I told you, in a diagram. We are going to try to understand the difference between diameter, radius, cross-sectional area, for you to see how it influences the speed of the blood. Okay, when and we have to know that this is inversely proportional. When the vessel's total cross-sectional area increases, okay, the flow velocity decreases. So the velocity is going to be the slowest in the capillaries, because we need time for gases and nutrient exchange. Now, let me show you the diagram. Okay, let me show you the diagram, and I'm going to tell you that there are two approaches to remembering this. If you like diagrams, physics, mathematics, okay, you can use this approach. Okay, you have here the representation of the arterioles, the capillaries, and the venous cross-sectional area. This is not the diameter of the blood vessels. Okay? One thing is the diameter of a single blood vessel, the diameter of the aorta, 2.5 centimeters, and another thing is the cross-sectional area of all the arteries in the body. It's like you add up the aorta plus the carotids plus the radial, plus the femoral, plus the popliteal, the diameter of all of them, you will have a cross-sectional area of all the arteries. You can do the same with the veins. Typically, for every artery, we have two veins, okay, or a vein that has a diameter that is double that of the artery. Okay, so if you add up all the veins of the body, all the diameters, you're going to have this cross-sectional area. But that is huge compared to the cross-sectional area of the arteries. Remember what we did the first day of class, and we put all the cells in one intracellular space, and all the veins, arteries, interstitial space in another place, extracellular. We are placing here all the arteries, all the veins. The veins contain 70% of the blood. The arteries and the capillaries contain the other 30%. And notice in the center, if we add up the diameter of all the capillaries of the body, what is the cross-sectional area that we have? Immense. How could we compare that to something that we normally have around? Okay, let's take the wide or the width of all the expressways in Miami. And then we are going to take the width of all the streets and avenues and put them together. Who wins? Streets. You take Turnpike, Palmetto, and Don Shula. Is there any other? I-95. Maybe there's another. Five. Maybe it's 50 meters. If you take all the streets, avenues, you can go to the moon and come back. Okay, with that distance. Exactly the same thing happens here. Okay, so notice that you have a representation of this here. Okay, and we are going to put together the cross-sectional area with the blood flow, or velocity of the blood flow. Notice how, as the cross-sectional area increases from the aorta to arteries to arterioles, the blood flow velocity goes down, 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 down. It lowers in the capillaries, and then when those capillaries start joining to form venules, the blood flow velocity starts increasing. Okay, because the objective of all this is that the amount of blood that enters the heart matches the amount of blood that goes out of the heart. Okay, and while it circulates throughout the capillaries, the blood has to go so slowly that there is time to pick up CO2 and deliver oxygen. Okay, the red blood cells, if you look at the capillaries, the red blood cells pass through the capillaries one by one. They are like squeezing their cell walls against the walls of the capillaries. They can go very fast. You go to the theater, you're not going to get out of the car in movement. You have to stop the car, you have to get out. Maybe someone else is going to go in. The same thing happens with these red blood cells when they move through the capillaries. So let's go back to our concepts. Then another very important concept is so I told you, you can use two approaches. You like physics, mathematics, you can use the diagram, radius, cross-sectional area, all that. If you don't like that, you simply use the biological logic. Okay, what are the capillaries for? For gas exchange. So where do we need a really, really slow blood flow? In the capillaries. Okay, and then in the other places, okay, the blood is going to go faster or more slowly, depending on the cross-sectional area. Then we have the resistance, okay, it's the force that opposes the blood flow of any fluid, in this case the blood. Same thing happens for the air when we study the lungs, inhalation, exhalation. It's a fluid, air is a fluid, blood is a fluid. And then the blood vessel diameter, that is, as we said at the beginning, is the most important factor, okay, determining the resistance to the blood flow. Okay, when the diameter of the vessel decreases, so we have dilation, constriction, when decreases the diameter, the resistance increases, and that will lead to a reduction in the blood flow. So we have a smaller opening, so there is going to be a smaller flow. And then we have to study blood pressure, and the difference between blood pressure, pulse pressure, what they are, how we measure them, what determines them. Pressure is simply the force that occurs because of the interaction of the blood, in this case, against the blood vessel walls. As the blood moves throughout the circulatory system, throughout the vessels, we measure it in millimeters of mercury, and it's going to be higher during systolic pressure and lower during diastole. Then we have pulse, which is simply a rhythmic. It's exactly as in music, pulse of any kind of musical piece. It's a rhythmic variation. It's the expansion of an artery because of the variations in the pressure inside the artery. During the cardiac cycle, during systole, it's going to be higher. During diastole, it's going to be smaller. So when we palpate an artery that is superficial, we're going to feel those rhythmic pulsations. And the pulse pressure is simply something that we calculate by taking the systolic and the diastolic pressure. It's the difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure. For example, if someone has 120/80, they are going to have a pulse pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. We have more concepts here. One of them is the mean arterial pressure. The mean arterial pressure is the product of the cardiac output and the systemic vascular resistance. And the cardiac output is something that we can calculate simply by multiplying what we call the stroke volume, or the amount of blood that the heart pumps in every beat, times the heart rate. Here we have an example. Someone may have a heart rate of 70, and if they have a stroke volume of 70 milliliters per beat, they are going to have a cardiac output of around 5 liters of blood per minute. We normally use, when we study the patients, we normally refer to the cardiac output, even in some definitions, they state that the cardiac output is the amount of blood that the left ventricle pumps in every minute. And that is true. But we have to remember that this is true for both sides of the heart. The left ventricle has a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute, and the right ventricle too. Because those 5 liters are going to enter, go through the lungs to enter the left ventricle. The ventricle is going to pump them out, then they are going to return. So both ventricles are going to have a cardiac output of 5 liters per minute. So if you add them together, the two sides of the heart, then we have a total of 10 liters per minute at rest. But we typically study only one of the chambers to make it easier. So you have there some formulas, mean arterial pressure. We use the cardiac output and the systemic vascular resistance that is given by the degree of constriction or dilation of the entire circulation, something that we normally don't measure in a physical examination. What is important from this formula is they are both directly proportional to the mean arterial pressure. So if we have an increase in the cardiac output or the systemic vascular resistance, the mean arterial pressure is going to increase. If they decrease, any of them decrease, we are going to have a decrease in the mean arterial pressure. Now notice that in homeostasis, our body, remember there are some regulated and controlled variables. In this case, the body can manipulate, can control the systemic vascular resistance by simply producing dilation constriction, or the cardiac output by changing the heart rate, contractility of the heart, and that way increasing or decreasing the cardiac output in order to regulate the blood pressure of the body. That's of those variables that can be manipulated, as we are going to see later, by many different ways. Okay, the actual important variable, regulated variable, is the blood pressure. Frida, what's your question?
Yes. So what's the difference between the mean arterial pressure and that, the mean arterial pressure and the actual blood pressure?
The mean arterial pressure.
And the blood pressure.
We are going to see that in the diagram later. Okay. And well, we have there other formulas. Okay, cardiac output. Another way of calculating the cardiac output, okay, is simply stroke volume times heart rate. And here we have the definition of stroke volume and an example that we can use to calculate the cardiac output that we mentioned before. Now, let's focus now on blood pressure, pulse pressure, okay, and try to see all these things together. When we talk about blood pressure, most important variable that our body tries to regulate, remember, this is what supplies blood to the brain. The blood pressure has two components. One is static, and the other is variable. Okay? The static component is what we call the mean arterial pressure. That is, imagine that you calculate, you have the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. You could calculate it in the entire circulation. Carotids, brachial, radial, okay, the femoral, different arteries, and you could calculate the average of all those blood pressures. You're going to obtain a number, okay, that is exactly like a line that you could trace in the center of this curve that you can see in this diagram. Okay, the upper diagram is plotting the blood pressure, okay, on the y-axis, how it varies, okay, in different places of the circulation, starting in the arteries, arterioles, capillaries in the centers, and the veins. Notice how the distance or the difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure is very high at the beginning in the large arteries, these elastic arteries at the beginning of the circulation, and the difference between that systolic and diastolic pressure goes down, 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 slowly, slowly, until it reaches the capillaries. Okay, in the capillaries there is still a tiny little bit of pulsation, but you can't perceive it in the physical exam. But there is, okay, if you had a device that is so precise, you could see some pulsation there. The physical exam, I repeat, we don't see that. And then when you move into the venous part of the circulation, notice that it's like a flat line. There is no pulsation there. Okay, so the pulse pressure in the veins is zero. There is no difference between systolic and diastolic pressure. Okay, so it goes from 40, as the example we said before, 120 minus 8, 40 in the elastic arteries, to, let's say, 35, 30, 25, 20, 10, 15, until it reaches, let's say, 0.1, just to say a number, and 0 in the veins. There is a sign, now that we're talking about pulsation, capillaries, and physical exam, there is a physical exam sign that probably you can see one day, okay, depending on wink sign. Let's see if we have any. See if we have any videos. This is something that you can actually see better if you are in the dark room and you put a lamp there, a flashlight or something. I don't think the quality is very good, but this is something which you can see pulsation, okay, in the capillaries or in the nail bed. Let me see if we have any other with the light. Let's see this one. And that is something that you can see if, for example, the patient has See? If the patient have aortic regurgitation, okay, you can see something like that, but you don't see that normally, okay, in the physical exam. It's called Quincke's sign, capillary pulsation. Okay, so there you can see this relationship between the blood pressure and the different blood vessels. On the lower diagram, we have a relationship. Okay, we are plotting the blood velocity, okay, in the same areas, capillaries, arteries, and veins. Notice the difference. Okay, here we have the velocity, and this is very similar to the diagram that we showed before with the cross-sectional area. Notice that the blood velocity is high, very high in these arterioles, okay, then goes very, very, very low, the speed in the capillaries, and then goes up again as we change the cross-sectional area. Okay, so, this is exactly the same diagram that we showed you at the beginning. Okay, this is exactly this line here, okay, but represented in this other diagram. So I wanted you to have these two together so you don't get confused, because these are the things that confuse the most the students. Okay, difference between pressure and velocity in the capillaries, in the arteries, and in the veins. And notice that the biggest difference is here. Okay, the blood pressure is very low, okay, in the veins, but the velocity increases, okay, because of the changes in the cross-sectional area. Another thing that is not represented, but I mentioned, is the pulse. Okay, the pulse is very, 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 very small in the capillaries, but there is still some. So if you have a question in which of the following areas we have the lowest, okay, the lowest pulse pressure, that is going to be the veins. In the veins is 0. In the capillaries maybe 0.1. Still the veins have the lowest pressure. Well, on the left side we have the determinants of what we call the systolic and diastolic pressure. Okay, systolic pressure is the one that we measure in the arteries when the heart is beating, okay, when the heart is squeezing the blood. During systole, notice that we have represented these arrows, okay, like compressing, stretching the walls of the arteries. That is what the blood does during systole. Then what happens during diastole, the heart starts relaxing, okay, and the pressure inside the ventricle goes very low. Remember, it can be as low as 10 millimeters of mercury. Okay, there is a moment when the aortic valve is going to close. Okay, so all the blood that stays inside the arterial system during diastole, once the aortic valve closes, okay, is going to be compressed by the elastic arteries, the aorta and the major branches. They're very elastic, so they are going to be distended during systole, and they are going to squeeze all that blood during diastole, because they have to send all that blood to different organs. So that action of these elastic arteries is what creates that pressure that we measure as the diastolic pressure, typically around 80 millimeters of mercury. These concepts of the elasticity of the arteries is something that we're going to be developing little by little until we get into pathophysiology. Okay, because with age and because of changes that occur as a result of inflammation, atherosclerosis, okay, and degenerative changes, these arteries are not so elastic. We are like 60, 70, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. We lose the elasticity of these arteries. So they are going to receive, okay, the action of the heart during systole, and they're not going to distend too much. Okay, they are going to be very resistant to that impact of the blood. They are not so compliant. They're very stiff. Okay, so in those cases, the systolic pressure is going to be greater than usual. So there is more impact. Okay, the blood vessel walls don't yield, are not compliant. Okay, so there is more action, more pressure of the blood against that stiff, or those stiff walls of the blood vessels. And that's what typically happens with age. There is an increase in the systolic blood pressure more than in the diastolic blood pressure. And we have to try to understand the applications of all this. And let me tell you, don't get crazy with this part, because this is something that we are giving you in advance for the future. Okay, because all these things, all these complex things that we are giving you is not to make you crazy, okay, and try to do crazy things. Simply things that we are going to be using in the future. I told you that the most important factor that determines the resistance to the circulation of the blood, to the blood flow, is the radius of the arteries or the blood vessels. Okay, the radius can increase or decrease because of the sympathetic parasympathetic activity, or because of medications, or because of prescriptions or non-prescription substances. Legal can be any way they are going to increase or decrease the diameter. They don't know about the constitution or about the law. They simply act. And also we can reduce the diameter simply by compressing the artery from outside, applying a tourniquet, or because an organ has a mass that is compressing the artery, or because the artery has something inside, like an embolus, like an atheroma plaque, thrombosis, inflammation. Okay, there are many ways that you can reduce the diameter, increasing the resistance to the blood circulation and decreasing the blood flow beyond that point. Okay, anyone has, for example, an obstruction of the carotids or obstruction of the coronary arteries. Okay, depending on how the obstruction is, how much is the obstruction we're going to have. Okay, milder or more severe problems with the blood flow to the myocardium in this case. There you have an equation, okay, that is very commonly used in physics when you are studying fluids, okay, to analyze how fluids will behave in different environments. And there are different factors, okay, that affect the blood flow in this case, or any fluid flow. There you have the difference in pressure between 0.1 and 0.2. There is also the length of the tube. That's something that doesn't change too much in our arteries. We are not having longer and shorter veins, okay, or arteries. That's something that is typically constant. So also the viscosity, the blood may be more or less viscous. And notice the radius. Notice that, for example, if we double the length of a pipe, or in this case of an artery, that we don't do, okay, and we start, for example, with a blood flow of 100 centimeters per second, if we double the length, we are going to half, okay, the flow of the fluid. If we double the viscosity of the fluid, instead of regular milk, we are going to have condensed milk. It's going to flow more slowly. Okay, so but if we double the viscosity, we are going to have half the flow. If we double the pressure, the pressure gradient, we are going to increase. We're going to double the flow. But notice what happens if we double the radius. That's a lot. Okay, it's not double. Okay, the flow now, instead of 100, is 1600. Okay, because notice that the influence of the radius is to the power of 4. Okay, on the flow. So a 19% increase in radius will double the flow rate. And notice what happens when we decrease the radius just by 19%. Okay, 19% only will have the volume flow rate, okay, or the flow in general. Okay, notice these numbers here. This is very interesting. For example, normally to have this flow of 100 cubic centimeters per minute, you need to develop a pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury. That is what our heart does normally. If we reduce 20%, okay, we are going to have a flow that is 41 centimeters per minute. In order to restore the normal blood flow to 100, notice the pressure that the heart would need to develop. That's not good. And if we have a reduction of 50% of the diameter, notice the flow is going to be 6.3, and you need to develop a pressure of almost 2,000 millimeters of mercury. And if it's even greater obstruction, notice the pressure that we need to develop.
How does the heart not explode?
Well, maybe some hearts are capable of that. That is theoretical.
Huh?
That is theoretical.
No, but how can the heart generate that much pressure? I mean,
It can't. It can't. It's unable to do that.
Professor,
Mhm.
so if with elderly, the arteries are more stiff, right? So you give the patient vasodilator, so but the artery that's stiff would respond still? No.
No. Vasodilators
Respond to
act.
everything else, but not the one.
That is where we were going to go now. Okay?
Okay.
This is like what we really need to remember, okay, of that. When we treat patients, we are not doing those calculations. Let me see the diameter of the arteries if it has been reduced by 10%, so I know what is the pressure. We don't work in those industrial things, okay? And this is what we need to keep in mind, okay? The most important contributors to the resistance to the blood circulation are the arterioles, the ones that have these, okay, possibilities of contracting, okay, all of these sphincters, okay, that we have in the arterioles, in the precapillary beds, okay, those are the areas where we have the greatest contributors to the flow resistance, okay, of course. Of all the previous slide, the idea you have to keep in mind is only a tiny obstruction can have dramatic effects, okay, in that circulation. Okay, so when you see, oh, the patient has only 20% obstruction, it's not only 20%, the effects on the blood flow are huge, remember that. Okay, it's not that 20% obstruction, 20% reduction in blood. No, it's to the power of 4, okay, the reduction in blood flow. Okay, so this equation that we saw before, okay, is helpful to analyze all those things. And then how we manage this, okay, simply by acting, okay, using medications to increase or decrease the circulation to different areas, giving vasoconstrictors, vasodilators that have different mechanisms. We are not gonna reduce the stiffness of an artery, okay? We could simply substitute the artery for another artery like we do in the coronaries, okay, bypass or stenting, but that's something that, okay, we don't achieve through medication. That is a surgical procedure. And well, I think we need a break, no?
Yes.
Okay, let's have a 10 minutes break, okay, to continue with more concepts. Okay, we're gonna jump one slide, 1 second. Physiological conditions, we're going to talk about. That's a very interesting question.
Like what style hypertrophy?
That's a very interesting. That's not the way it develops. Physiologically, no, but we get hypertrophy if the heart has to work Because how many hours you work out per day?
Yeah.
Sometimes 0.
So define workout for me. There are many types of workout.
Para la casa, limpiar el piso.
Hypertrophy develops when the heart has to work out most of the day against stiff arteries, against constricted arteries, so it has to overcome that mean arterial pressure. Okay, well, that's interesting question. So here we have other concepts, okay, and before going there, it's important to remember there is a law, it's in the previous slide, that is the Frank-Starling law, that simply says that when the heart receives too much blood, it will work more, okay, to pump the blood out. Okay, it's like, mind you are working in a factory, you have to, okay, complete 5 boxes per minute, and someone didn't come to work, you have to do 10 per minute. Well, you have to work faster. It's exactly the same. And how the heart does it? Well, simply our heart has exactly like the skeletal muscles, some contractile proteins, actin and myosin. Okay, they have different degrees of interaction. When the heart is in diastole or systole, they have different degrees of interaction between actin and myosin. And the more you stretch those fibers, the more, okay, they can, or the greater the force that the heart can develop. Okay, let's say this is actin and myosin, and you only separate them a little bit. It's difficult to do anything, to develop any kind of effective work there. Okay, mind that you have to, we are playing baseball and you have your arm tied, you only can do this. How far can that ball go? No, if you are tied here, you can develop more, no? Have more room, and if you have your arms free, now you can, okay, pitch, okay, faster, longer distance. The same thing happens with actin and myosin. Okay, the more you separate them, the greater the force, okay, that the heart may develop. Of course, that has a limit. That's why some people, when they have a dilated heart, they are unable to do anything. Because now actin and myosin won't meet anymore. So understanding that, and also you can use the example of a rubber gum. Have a rubber gum in your fingers. You want to explain anything to the class? Or? Okay. You simply stretch it half a centimeter, nothing happens. If you stretch it a lot, it's going to hurt. Okay, the more you stretch the cardiac fibers, the stronger the contraction is going to be. So we are going to try to understand how different factors work together, how the body controls different variables in order to maintain the cardiac output, the blood pressure, and finally the perfusion to the brain, which is the final objective of all this. Okay, we are going to see the interaction between what we call the preload to the heart, okay, and what happens with that blood once it enters the heart when the heart contracts. Okay, there you can see the representation of what we call the preload, that is determined by the venous return, the blood that returns to the heart from the systemic circulation. Okay, so this preload to the heart depends on the diameter of the veins and depends on the amount of blood that is inside the circulation. That means if the veins are dilated, remember there we have 70% of the blood. Okay, all the blood is pooling into the veins, but if we constrict the veins, we are squeezing that blood towards the heart. We are increasing the amount of blood that returns to the heart, so the ventricle, the left ventricle, will stretch to accommodate more blood. If we stretch more, the cavity of the left ventricle, the contraction is going to be stronger. Okay, now we use the amount of blood that returns to the heart, the diameter of the arteries, to understand how the preload changes. But the actual preload is the degree of stretch of the cardiac fibers. Okay, so having an accurate measurement of the preload is almost impossible clinically. We estimate it, but for us to measure the preload, we would have to put a device measuring the stretch of the cardiac fibers, and we don't do that. Okay? Simply understand how it can vary. If you want to increase the preload, you simply constrict the veins. Give epinephrine, squeeze the veins. You want to reduce the preload, give nitroglycerin, will dilate the veins. So all the blood is going to pool into the veins. You want to increase the preload, give an IV solution. You are increasing the amount of blood that is circulating. You want to decrease the preload, make the patient bleed. No? Or give a diuretic. Okay, but it's going to be not so fast. Leeches have their utility. If you have a patient with a volume overload, you put leeches and they are going to get the volume out. They didn't have LASIX back in the day. So you have to put leeches in to get the blood out. Good for hemochromatosis, for excess blood things. So now the blood enters into the ventricle, okay, and we are going to have a volume of blood filling the ventricle at the end of the diastole. Remember, during diastole, the heart relaxes, blood flows passively, okay, into the ventricle, and at the end of the diastole, we are going to have the contraction of the atria that push the blood into the heart. That is something that we call the atrial kick, okay, and that is what makes the end diastolic volume, and that's what stretches the ventricles at the end of the diastole, and that's what puts in motion the contraction, this kick of the atria. Very important, physiologically speaking, and the reason why people who have atrial fibrillation has so much difficulty to exercise. Because they don't have the contribution of the atria to the end diastolic volume, they don't have this kick of the atria, they don't have these factors that is so important to develop or to increase the cardiac output during exercise. At rest is not important. 5 liters per minute, nah, that's okay. You don't need the atria for that. But when you need to increase the cardiac output to 20 liters per minute, if you don't have the atria pushing blood there, it's not going to work. Now there you have on the left the representation of the end diastolic volume. Okay, the amount of blood at the end of the diastole. At rest, 120 milliliters, more or less. Ventricles contract, blood goes out, that is the stroke volume, that typically is around 70 milliliters. And as you notice there, the ventricles are not going to get totally empty. We have some blood remaining that we call the end systolic volume. Okay. It's difficult to measure how much blood went out. We are not going to wait, okay, let me see, 1 liter, 2 liters. We don't do that. But we can measure with using ultrasound, echocardiography, how much blood is at the end of the diastole, how much blood is at the end of the systole. And we simply subtract. End diastolic volume minus end systolic volume to determine what is the stroke volume. And that is the formula that you have here. Okay, and if you want to calculate the cardiac output, you simply take the stroke volume times the heart rate, and you have the cardiac output. Okay? Now, what else we have in this diagram? Notice that for this to happen, the pressure that the left ventricle develops has to be greater, has to surpass the diastolic pressure to be able to open the aortic valve. Okay, that is something that happens every day, every minute. We don't worry about that, we take for granted, but we shouldn't take for granted. There is a moment in our life when that's not going to work. A moment. Okay. And also, we have a factor here that is what we call afterload. Notice that I'm placing the arrows against the stroke volume. Okay? Because these are different factors that try to stop the blood from being ejected from the heart. Okay? Can be, for example, any problem in the aortic valve. If it's stiff, the heart is going to have to generate more pressure to open the aortic valve. Cases of aortic stenosis, too narrow valve. Or people who have a stiff aorta, stiff arteries. Okay, so anytime the person has elevated mean arterial pressure or diastolic pressure, okay, the heart is going to have to develop greater work, greater pressure. It's going to develop more stress. And exactly as I said for the preload, if we want to actually measure the afterload, we have to put a device in the left ventricle wall to measure the stress. We don't do that clinically. But we know that if the mean arterial pressure or just the diastolic pressure is elevated, the heart is suffering. The heart is working. It's like someone calls you, well, I'm here in my job. This guy didn't come to work today. He called sick. Now I have to be here and there. You say, oh my goodness, he's under stress. You don't need to put an electroencephalogram to see if your friend has stress or not. He's very sad, and you understand that. The same thing we do with the blood pressure. When the mean arterial pressure is elevated, the heart is suffering. Okay, we don't need to put the electrodes or measuring devices there to see if that's true or not. And that stress chronically is going to represent a problem because it's going to produce injury. And when you have injury in the cardiac cells, there is no way that we can take another and divide it and replace the one that is missing. Okay, this cardiac muscle is not a tissue that we can create again from stem cells or nothing like that. We are simply going to substitute the dead cardiac fibers with
tissue.
collagen, connective tissue, fibrotic tissue, and there is a moment when the heart is unable to contract properly and the electrical impulses don't reach certain places because there is collagen there. Okay, it's like putting plastic in there, inside the motherboard of the computer, or super glue or something. It's not going to work properly. It's what's going to happen chronically in these cases. So, is there any other concept here? I don't think so. Let's move to the previous slide that you have there, the concepts. Okay, contractility is easy to understand how strong the heart contracts. It's going to increase with catecholamines. Catecholamines, remember the ventricles, the contractile cells, have mostly adrenergic receptors. Okay, acetylcholine doesn't influence the contractility. Okay, acetylcholine is mostly for the synovial node and AV node. Catecholamines increase intracellular calcium, so we increase the force. Okay, we get the same with digoxin. Okay, digoxin will inhibit the sodium-potassium pumps. It's going to lead to depolarization, and it's going to increase the amount of calcium inside the cell, so it's going to make the contraction stronger. So you have the concept of preload and afterload. Okay, the way we calculate ejection fraction. And ejection fraction is something that we haven't mentioned. And notice that this is a percentage, it's a fraction. Okay, we already mentioned what is stroke volume. Okay, ejection fraction is simply the percentage, not the amount. It's not milliliters. It's the percentage, okay, of the end diastolic volume that is ejected from the left ventricle. That is a very important concept. Okay, normally it's between 55 and 70. That means, to take round numbers, if the end diastolic volume is 100 and the stroke volume is 50, the ejection fraction is 50%. Okay, but we are going to use here more physiological numbers. Okay, you have a person with an end diastolic volume of 120, and systolic volume is going to be 50. Okay, from that you calculate the stroke volume. It's the same example we have been using, 70 milliliters, and now you use that formula. Stroke volume divided by the end diastolic volume. So what is the percentage of the end diastolic volume that went out? Of those 120 milliliters, 70%, okay, 58% or 70 milliliters were ejected. Okay, and that is a totally normal ejection fraction. Okay, from 55 to 70. If the person has an ejection fraction below 50, that means heart failure. Okay, we are going to be studying in the future different types of heart failure. Subdivided into reduced ejection fraction, heart failure, also known as systolic failure. Heart is so weak that receives 200 and pumps 100. or less than 50% because it's unable to develop contractions. Okay, that is systolic failure or reduced ejection fraction heart failure. There are other moments, for example, the cardiac walls are so thick that the cavity is like this.
So you have those.
Maybe only, instead of 120, you can put only 100. But the contraction is okay. From those 100 milliliters, we pump 70. 70% is huge percentage. So that is normal ejection fraction heart failure. Okay, simply a proportion. And that's what we call diastolic failure. Okay, the heart is pumping perfectly, but it's not receiving enough. Problem is in diastole, not with systole. Okay, those are the things that we are going to be studying in the future. Now, we have to talk about many more things here, and notice that we are like connecting, again, with autonomic system, nervous systems. Impossible to study one system without integrating with the other. The perfusion to the brain is the priority for the body. Okay? The body is going to sacrifice everything to guarantee the perfusion to the brain. For example, let's say we are in a very hot place. Okay, and we don't have water, we can't move from there to get anything, we don't have a cell phone. Okay. Immediately when we start having these very high temperatures, we are going to activate the mechanisms that cool our body. Okay, we're going to start sweating, vasodilation, so we don't increase the core temperature, the blood temperature, the CSF temperature. But the sweating, the dilation, starts making the blood pressure drop, and drop, and drop, and drop. And there is a moment when we have receptors that we call baroreceptors, many places, great arteries, veins, atria, that detect that the blood pressure is going down, and the brain doesn't like that. We are going to activate the sympathetic nervous system to produce vasoconstriction in the skin, no more heat loss, because heat loss represents water loss, and we don't want that. And we may die of a heat stroke, but we are not going to get hypovolemic. The brain is going to continue receiving very hot blood, but it's going to receive blood. Okay, so it's going to stop the heat or thermoregulation to guarantee the perfusion. Okay, because it's more important. Continue giving blood to the brain. It doesn't matter that it's a bit warmer. Okay. So we have many different mechanisms to control the blood volume, the blood pressure. Okay, we have the baroreceptors. Some of them are more responsive to low pressure or high pressure. Some of them to both. Atria, roots of the great veins, carotid sinus. Notice that I put there the cranial nerve. Important piece of information that can be used in questions. A patient has a lesion in the cranial nerve number 10, the vagus, or the 9, which of the following will not transmit impulses, okay, to the brain, to the hypothalamus? Also, we have the participation of the kidney. We have a baroreceptor system in the kidney. Okay, the kidney has these juxtaglomerular cells, okay, that are there in the bifurcation between afferent and efferent arterioles. If there is a drop in the blood pressure in the kidney, that's going to activate the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. May occur if there is a systemic drop in blood pressure or simply because the kidney is not receiving blood. Imagine someone that has an embolism affecting the renal artery. That kidney is not going to get enough blood. The kidney says, what's going on? And start making renin. Okay? And that can produce a systemic increase in blood pressure. Because the kidney is going to continue releasing renin and activating angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, producing aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to retain sodium and water, and it's going to increase the systemic blood pressure. That means when you have a patient with hypertension that doesn't respond to treatment, well, I gave you a diuretic, and now I'm giving you a calcium channel blocker. Wow, the blood pressure is still elevated. Let me give you, no, wait. Before giving another medication, let's do an ultrasound in the kidneys to see if there is any problem there. Okay, maybe there is a stenosis of the arteries. Maybe there is a problem that is making the kidneys react and produce aldosterone when they shouldn't. And we have some sensors in the liver, central nervous system, though not so important like the previous two. Now those are the receptors that send afferent information, sensory information, okay, to the hypothalamus, to the medulla oblongata, okay, where we have the cardiovascular centers. We have a center that we call the pressor, and we have a depressor. So one increases the pressure, the other decreases it. One activates the sympathetic, the other the parasympathetic nervous system. And they are located in the hypothalamus, in the medulla oblongata. And we have a nucleus that is there in the medulla oblongata that is called the nucleus tractus solitarius, NTS. That is a very, very important nucleus there that receives information from the limbic system, receives information from taste receptors, smell receptors, from the sensors for blood pressure, from the osmoreceptors, almost from everywhere in the body, and activates or deactivates sympathetic or parasympathetic system depending on the integration of all that. So when you analyze the connection of this nucleus tractus solitarius, imagine a nucleus that is receiving information from the baroreceptors, osmoreceptors, and also the limbic system. So when we are afraid, that nucleus will react and will activate the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system depending on the summation. Remember temporal, spatial summation of all these signals from many different places. Taste receptors. We just ate something that is poisonous, or we consider to be poisonous, or we smell something that is like dangerous. Okay, all this will be taken care of by this nucleus tractus solitarius. And then we have some mechanisms for the that we call afferent or effectors, that activate the effector systems. We have a mechanism at the level of the kidney that we are going to dedicate more time when we study the kidney itself. The kidneys regulate the amount of urine that we make. We have too much water, we produce more. We are dehydrated, we produce less. Regulating the diameter of afferent arteriole, we make more or less urine. Okay, we have these renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. We're going to explain in more detail later. The ADH, vasopressin system, that retains water. Remember one important difference, vasopressin, ADH is free water, aldosterone is salt and water. Okay, you have difficulty with that, do as I used to do in medical school, saldosterone, salt and water, saldosterone. Saldosterone, saldosterone, saldosterone until it stays there. So it's salt and water.
ADH.
Then we have the other factors, prostaglandins. Prostaglandins work dilating afferent arteriole, and means sending more blood to the kidney to produce more urine. And we have the atrial natriuretic peptide from the heart, and there is a volume overload. Remember, this is the antagonist of the aldosterone. Okay, so it's going to stop the salt retention. Salt is going to go away and will take water with it. It's like a natural diuretic that we make to get rid of the excess salt and water. And there are some renal sympathetic nervous system fibers that are directly connected to the juxtaglomerular cells, just in case we need. Okay, when we study the sympathetic response to stress, okay, we are going to see that some sympathetic nerves are going to the, if you remember, the adrenal medulla to stimulate the production of epinephrine, but also some sympathetic fibers go directly inside the kidney to stimulate renin release. Because let's imagine that we are losing blood. We have to wait until the blood pressure drops for the kidneys to realize, oh my goodness, the blood pressure is going down. Let's produce renin. And renin will go to the liver and activate angiotensin, and angiotensin will be activated in the lung to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to go to the hypothalamus and, oh, let's release ADH. and it's going to go to the adrenal cortex. Oh, let's produce aldosterone. How much time we have? Okay, we are bleeding, really bleeding. Not too much. We don't have the luxury of waiting for those organs to communicate. We have sympathetic nerves that go directly to the kidney, and immediately when we perceive the situation, renin is produced. So we have immediately enough aldosterone, okay, in the circulation, something that is great for stress, emergency situations, but it's bad when you simply are worried about something that may happen tomorrow. The same is going to happen. We are, oh my goodness, tomorrow we have final test. Oh my goodness, amygdala, nucleus tractus solitarius, sympathetic nervous system, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, blood pressure elevated, heart is working too much. Okay, so that's the idea. Because this stress is real or imaginary as well. Okay, all the body is going to respond that way. So, it's time for a diagram, so we go back to the situation, the things that we have to master. Remember, the most important thing that the body regulates is the blood pressure for the brain. The rest of the organs can wait. Okay, the skin doesn't need blood. Okay. Other organs can have more or less. The heart is important. The priority is always the brain. When you have a diagram like this, at least I like starting from the last part. Okay, for example, if we study a condition that produces fever and pain and dizziness, I like starting for this in the symptoms, not in the etiology, because symptoms is how patients present. No one comes to the ER saying, I have this bacteria in this place, or I have this syndrome on this day. No. People come because, oh, I feel fatigued. I have cough, I have fever. So this is what we see in our patients, the blood pressure, low or high, or normal. By the way, normal doesn't mean that they are okay. Someone may have an internal bleeding. We measure the blood pressure. It's perfectly fine, 135/80. That's epinephrine producing constriction. Those are the homeostatic mechanisms keeping up. Okay, maybe even they may have the blood pressure elevated, and that is their response to bleeding. Okay, don't wait until the blood pressure actually drops. What are the determinants of the blood pressure? Two things: the cardiac output and the total peripheral resistance. If we increase either or, we are going to have an increase in the blood pressure. If we decrease either or, we are going to have a decrease in the blood pressure. Remember, the total peripheral resistance, okay, depends on the degree of constriction or dilation of the arterioles in the body, okay, blood vessels in general. That will depend on the amount of sympathetic, parasympathetic control, or the hormones or neurotransmitters. That will depend on the presence of hormones, okay, that will promote a more increase or decrease in pressure. So that's more autonomic endocrine control. And we normally don't measure that. We don't have any test in the physical exam to measure the total peripheral resistance. We estimate, depending on the arterial blood pressure and the cardiac output, where the problem is. Okay, if we have a person that is tachycardic, okay, let's work on the tachycardia to see if the blood pressure goes down. But if the person has a normal heart rate, it's probably the total peripheral resistance, the one that we have to work on and produce some dilation with calcium channel blockers or anything that opens up the blood vessels. Now, the cardiac output depends on stroke volume, heart rate. You multiply stroke volume times heart rate. If we increase either or, the cardiac output is going to go up. The same thing, if we decrease either or, cardiac output goes down and the blood pressure goes down. The heart rate depends on autonomic, endocrine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, thyroid hormones, all these things that may affect the heart rate. Medications, okay, we are not including medications, but medications too. This is physiology. We are not entering in pathophysiology yet. Then we have the stroke volume that depends on the contractility, okay, and depends on the venous return. Again, all these things that you have in this diagram, all of them are directly proportional. That's why you don't have any minus, plus, there are increases or decreases. All this is directly proportional. If you increase the contractility or the venous return, you will increase the stroke volume, and that will increase the cardiac output, and that will increase the blood pressure. And the venous return depends on the blood volume, also known as volemia, and the autonomic nervous system, endocrine system regulation. Okay, again, we increase or decrease, we are going to have a decrease or increase in the venous return. Now, that may be easy to study. And remember, try to use or substitute these things with examples. How can we increase or decrease the blood volume? Giving fluids or removing fluids. Or telling you, patient has been vomiting for 3 days or has a diarrhea that is difficult to control. The blood pressure is low. The jugular venous pressure is, we don't see it. We don't see any dilated vein anywhere. That means low blood volume. Now, if the patient has a volume overload, patient has edema, the jugular veins are here, swollen because of the increased volume, then you know that this will be increased, and this will be increased, and this will be increased, and you have to work on the removing that fluid with diuretics, for example. Okay. Venous return also depends on the diameter of the veins. You have in the veins 70% of the blood. You squeeze them, you send more blood to the heart. You dilate them, blood pours in the veins. And that's the reason why we give nitroglycerin to patients that have chest pain. Okay? Not because the nitro is going to dilate the coronary arteries. It's not going to do anything in the coronary arteries, but it's going to take the blood into the veins so the heart doesn't receive too much blood and doesn't have to pump that blood. We are using the Frank-Starling mechanism. Now, if I send more blood, the heart is going to work more. So let me send less. How I send less? I'm not going to put leeches in the patient. Simply dilate the veins. Nitroglycerin. Oh, still it's pain. Let me give you a beta blocker. Reducing the contractility together with the reduction in the venous return. The heart is resting. Okay, resting. Because the only thing you don't want in the patient with chest pain is a heart that is working more. What about morphine? Why we give morphine to patients with chest pain, angina, myocardial infarction? What will morphine do to the heart, to the coronaries, to the veins? How morphine is going to act there? We already gave nitro.
Does it decrease the breathing also?
Yeah, but that's not what we're looking for.
Decrease.
We need the patients to breathe.
Does it decrease contractility?
It's not exactly that. What increases in a patient that has a myocardial infarction and in the family? What is increased? What they are afraid of? What is everybody afraid of when they have chest pain? They are going to die. And when you think you're going to die, what is activated in your body? Sympathetic nervous system. So that chest pain is activating the sympathetic system, is increasing epinephrine, is increasing renin, and that epinephrine is going to make the heart beat faster. So we want to silence the heart. We give morphine, they don't feel pain. I'm better now. And we put oxygen, even if the saturation is 100%. We put oxygen, we put all the things that we have to do. No pain, no sympathetic nervous system. They are resting there on the heart, and they can wait for surgery. Okay, that's the purpose. Of course, everything has to be well indicated. Okay. For example, if your patient has a right-sided heart failure, don't give nitroglycerin ever. Okay, because if the right ventricle is the one who's failing and we dilate the veins, there is not gonna be any blood reaching the right ventricle. Okay, the right ventricle is volume dependent for working. So if it doesn't receive the blood that it's receiving, it's going to stop working. It's a ventricle that is develops very little pressure, it's going to collapse immediately. Okay, we don't use nitro in patients with right-sided or inferior wall myocardial infarction. Even just if they have low blood pressure, we don't use nitroglycerin because that is probably a right-sided myocardial infarction. Okay, when someone has anterior or lateral wall myocardial infarction, the sympathetic nervous system is activated immediately. When you have a lower wall, inferior wall, that's going to stimulate the parasympathetic nerves, and that's going to increase lots of acetylcholine to the heart, and it's going to drop the heart rate and the blood pressure. Okay, that's more characteristic of the right-sided or inferior wall myocardial infarction. So low blood pressure, never nitroglycerin.
So, Professor, we as medical professionals would learn to identify certain signs and things like that in order to give nitroglycerin, but what about those patients that have that little thing hanging from their neck with a nitroglycerin pill, and how do they know?
Because they probably have it indicated, because if your patient has, let's say, 50% obstruction of the left main coronary artery, you know that's the one that's going to produce a problem. But if it's the right coronary artery, you don't give nitro to that patient. Okay.
So that person's not going to have that little vial.
Yeah. In that case, no. Okay.
And is there not the possibility that if they do have that left side failure, that all of a sudden they might feel symptoms, but it's actually related to the right, and they don't know any better, and they just pop the pill?
There's
Yeah.
no way to know.
May happen. May happen. But there are cases that there is nothing we can do. Also happens that someone has never had chest pain. Maybe the husband, wife, they have some nitro at home. I have chest pain. No, take this pill. What can you do in that case?
The famous antibiotics.
Yeah. So here we have the hormonal part, okay, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. The ADAs, we have already mentioned many of them. Now we have a couple of chemicals that we haven't mentioned yet. For example, endothelin, which is the most powerful vasoconstrictor that we have in the body. Okay, endothelin is more powerful than epinephrine, but that is something that is produced locally. Okay, if you remember when you studied hemostasis in the past, that you have an injury to a blood vessel, that there is a transient vasoconstriction and then vasodilation. That transient vasoconstriction is produced by endothelin. Okay, there is no time for the adrenal medulla to produce epinephrine and epinephrine goes there to produce constriction there locally. No. Endothelin is produced locally when there is an injury. Okay, and then as a result of the inflammation, we're going to have more changes. We're going to have other prostaglandins, for example, producing dilation, inflammation, histamine. So those are the vasopressor hormones. And the vasodepressor, we have mentioned already the natriuretic peptides like A and P, B and P, prostaglandins, and nitric oxide. Okay, that also works locally, okay, producing vasodilation. It's a very, very powerful vasodilator. The last thing we are going to be seeing is the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Okay, that we need to understand very well, and we are going to be studying in several systems, not only here. Okay, it's something that we repeat over and over. Renin is an enzyme. The best definition of an enzyme is a molecular tool that you use to cut things or join things. Okay, this is an enzyme that simply cuts proteins. It's a proteolytic, takes a big protein and cuts it in pieces, okay, producing one of them that is an active protein and another that is inactive or simply does something else. Produced by the juxtaglomerular cells that may produce renin in response to low pressure in the kidney or simply as a result of the direct stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system. Notice that there are beta-1 receptors. These are the ones that respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, if there is any fall in the arteriolar, afferent arteriolar, thank you. In the afferent arteriolar pressure, that's going to produce renin. Okay, renin it's gonna activate, okay, all these systems, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, and then you have other factors that may stimulate the system. For example, hyponatremia. Remember that the final hormone of this system is aldosterone. Aldosterone retains sodium. So one stimulus for renin, okay, activation is hyponatremia, because we want to get that sodium into the blood and correct that. Okay, diuretics may stimulate it, hypovolemia, constriction of the renal artery, different factors.
So, Professor, so ADH and aldosterone in that sense work as a sort of antagonist to one another?
ADH and aldosterone?
And aldosterone?
No, aldosterone and ANP,
Wait, what
atrial natriuretic peptide.
Oh, so we're talking about ANP now. Okay,
No,
so
we're talking about renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system.
no, because
The
you mentioned-
antagonist of aldosterone is
yeah, but you mentioned that it acts in response to hyponatremia, right? And doesn't ADH produce hyponatremia?
in excess, yes. In excess.
In-
Normally, no.
So and that's
Normally, it doesn't. No. Normal regulation, no. It's when you have SIADH, inappropriate ADH production. Physiologically, no, it's not going to get there.
I
Okay.
remember that from the test, so it's like
And ADH and the RAS system, they are both activated at the same time because they have to work together in producing vasoconstriction when there is stress. They are not antagonistic. Okay, physiologically they are not antagonistic. Now, if someone has, let's say, a tumor producing aldosterone, and aldosterone is retaining sodium and increasing the bulimia, etc., okay, ADH is going to be released to try to dilute that blood, to try to, okay. But normally. Now, angiotensin 2 also is typically, okay, produced by this enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme, that is in the endothelial cells, typically in the lung, but they can be located in many different organs. Remember, these are some of these are the receptors for the coronavirus, okay, C receptors too, and that's why besides producing lung infection, okay, in many patients also we found coronavirus in the liver, in the testes, in the pancreas, in many organs, because these ACE receptors are located in many different endothelial cells throughout the body. And also there are some mechanisms that activate the angiotensin 2 that don't depend on ACE. Okay, there are other pathways. And that is simply a piece of knowledge that we need to understand just in case we see, okay, I'm giving this medication to this patient, maximum dose, and it's not working. Okay, why we still have this elevated aldosterone? Because maybe the patient is using other mechanisms to activate angiotensin. Here you have the diagram, okay, of this RAS system. Okay, this renin, okay, you see they are being released by the kidney, will cut angiotensinogen, okay, which is a precursor of angiotensin 1. Every time you see the suffix ogen, know that is what we know as zymogen, which is a precursor, okay, a precursor of an enzyme or any other active protein. So what the renin does, it cuts between the N and the O. And instead of angiotensinogen, we have angiotensin 1. Because then this has to be converted, has to be cut again, okay, and be converted to angiotensin 2, which is the active form of this protein. And that angiotensin 2 has so many actions in the body. Notice that it will produce or stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, will lead to increase in sodium, water retention, blood pressure, blood volume increase. Goes to the hypothalamus to stimulate the thirst mechanism, will produce constriction of the smooth muscle. Angio is blood vessel, tensing, produces vasoconstriction, stimulates ADH release from the posterior pituitary, okay, and we'll have some actions also at the level of the kidney that we are going to be studying more in detail in the nephrology part. Then you have all these effects, but the one I want you to pay attention to is the last one. So you understand why we use ACE inhibitors even if the patients have normal blood pressure. Okay? Because when someone has hypertension for a long time, or when they have chronic tissue injury for a long time, the effects of angiotensin II are going to lead to cellular hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the tissues. May occur in the heart, may occur in any organ. This is a hormone that is a growth factor, will stimulate hypertrophy, hyperplasia. Okay, and we are preventing something that we call remodeling of the heart, remodeling of the different organs. Okay, that will make at the end, if we don't stop this process, will make that the only solution that they have is a heart transplant. Okay, or a kidney transplant, depending on what is the organ that is being affected by hypertension. And we're gonna stop here, okay? We're gonna leave the rest for tomorrow, the cardiac cycle thing. Okay, so see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is at 8 a.m., right?
Yes.
Okay, see you tomorrow with the
This indicator will predict that from happening. This indicator will predict that from happening.
Excellent.
Is there a relationship between like COVID, ICU